In this video, I'll cover 3 related topics. In the first part, I'll cover attitudes and persuasion. Although the study of attitudes is considered a subtopic of social psychology, it has quite a lot of overlap with cognitive psychology, as you'll soon discover. In the last part of the video, I'll close by discussing a specific application of attitudes, that is, the prejudices we might hold about certain groups of people and the potential negative consequences therein. An attitude is simply a valence, that is, a positive or negative evaluation that is attached to a particular attitude object. For example, if you like puppies, then puppies is the attitude object and you have a positive valence or evaluation of that object. As another example, I personally don't care much for country music. Sorry to all you country music fans. In this example, then, country music is the attitude object and I have a negative attitude or evaluation of it. You can even have a positive or negative evaluation of yourself, which is what we call self-esteem. Researchers believe that objects and their associated valences are connected to each other cognitively via a semantic network, which is a kind of interrelated web. This is important because if one concept is activated in the network, that activation can spread more easily to more closely related concepts. We'll return to this idea in a minute. Researchers also think that attitudes can be either explicit, that is, we're consciously aware of them, or implicit, that is, beneath our conscious awareness. For example, my attitude toward country music is explicit. I'm aware that I don't like country music all that much, and I can report on this if asked. But what about implicit attitudes? How do you study an attitude that the person, him or herself, is unaware of? That's a tricky question and an area of ongoing academic debate. By far, the most common way to measure implicit attitudes is with what is called the IAT, which stands for Implicit Association Test. The setup for this test is a little bit complicated and occurs in 3 phases. In the first phase, participants are shown words on a computer screen and they're asked to categorize the words as either being positive or negative. If the word is positive, such as pleasant, they press the E key on the keyboard, and if the word is negative, such as angry, they press the I key. In the second phase, participants repeat this task, but rather than categorizing positive or negative words, they classify the attitude object of interest. For example, they might categorize faces as being either black or white. Or, in the case of self-esteem, they might categorize words as being either related to the self or other. In the final phase, the 2 categorization tasks are combined into one. In the case of self-esteem, for example, the person would press the I key for either a positive word or a word relating to the self, and they would press the E key for negative words or words relating to other. The pairings are then switched, that is, positive words are paired with other and negative words are paired with the self. After participants have completed this task, the researchers can then compare which pairing or association was easier for the participant to make, as indicated by their reaction times. Remember that in the semantic network, if 2 concepts are paired together, they should be more easily co-activated. So if participants respond faster when self was paired with positive words, then that might indicate a positive implicit attitude toward the self or a positive implicit self-esteem. Similarly, if people find it easier to associate a particular group of people with negative words, then this could potentially be an indication of a negative implicit attitude toward that group, what we call implicit bias. We'll return to the idea of implicit bias at the end of the video. Although the IAT is quite popular and currently used in a lot of research to measure implicit attitudes, it's important to note that it's also not without its critics. Once we have an attitude, can it be changed? That's where the science of persuasion comes in, at least in terms of trying to change our explicit attitudes. How does persuasion occur? One of the most popular models of persuasion is called the Elaboration Likelihood Model, or ELM for short. This model proposes that persuasion can occur in one of 2 ways, or routes. The first route, called the central route, relies on persuasion via logic and reasoning. For example, let's say that someone initially has a negative attitude about electric vehicles. If the person then changes their mind after reading a lot of facts about the positive attributes of EVs, they would be using the central route to persuasion. In contrast, the peripheral route relies on easy cues called heuristics that serve as proxies for argument quality. For example, imagine 2 arguments debating the pros and cons of electric cars. One argument is poor in quality but very long, whereas the other argument is stronger but shorter. A person using the peripheral route to persuasion may be easily convinced to go with the longer argument simply because it's longer. In other words, they didn't actually engage in the mental effort needed to really evaluate the quality of each argument. They simply went with whichever one seemed on the surface to be more convincing. Other heuristics might include things like if a product is being endorsed by an attractive individual or a popular celebrity. Again, notice that this has nothing to do with the actual quality of the product or argument itself. According to the ELM, the central route to persuasion requires that a person engages in elaboration. That is, they really pay attention to and evaluate whether a particular argument is high or low quality. This elaboration takes mental effort. That is, it takes up working memory capacity. Remember that our working memory capacity is limited. We can only process so much information at once. Therefore, if people's working memory is already occupied with some other task, such as if the person is distracted, then they will be unable to engage in the central route to persuasion. At other times, people may have sufficient working memory capacity, but they may simply be unmotivated to expend the mental energy needed to elaborate on the quality of a particular argument. For example, if I don't care that much about EVs and I don't plan on buying one in the future, I may not be motivated to pay attention to the details of each argument and instead may rely on peripheral cues, such as whether or not the product is endorsed by a particular celebrity. All else being equal, then, people are more likely to engage in the central route to persuasion if they're sufficiently motivated and have sufficient working memory capacity to do so. In the last part of this video, I'll discuss a particular application of attitudes, that is, our prejudices about different groups of people. First, it's important to define some terms. Stereotypes are a generalized set of cognitive beliefs about a particular group. For example, a common stereotype of millennials is that they are broke because they pay too much money for specialty coffees and avocado toast. Although some stereotypes, like the one I just mentioned, might sound obviously negative, other stereotypes might sound on the surface to be positive, but they can still have harmful effects. For example, a common quote-unquote positive stereotype of Asian Americans is that they tend to be good at math. Yet that's not true for every Asian American. Not everyone is good at or even enjoys math. When labeled as such purely on the basis of one's group membership, this can be experienced as deeply uncomfortable. Whereas stereotyping involves a set of cognitive beliefs, prejudice has more to do with negative feelings or valuations that are associated with members of a particular group. In other words, prejudice is a negative attitude towards certain individuals based solely on their group membership. Lastly, discrimination has to do with people's actual behavior and treatment of others, and whether that treatment is more or less fair. Of course, these three concepts are certainly all interrelated. That is, people may hold a prejudiced attitude toward a person if they have negative beliefs or stereotypes about that person's group membership. And if people have negative stereotypes and prejudices about a certain group of people, they may be in turn more likely to discriminate against someone belonging to that group, such as being less likely to hire them for a job. As I hinted at previously, sometimes people may harbor negative stereotypes and prejudices of which they are relatively unaware. These so-called implicit biases are thought to be shaped by learned associations between particular qualities and social categories. For example, if a person routinely sees millennials being depicted as lazy, these two concepts may become linked in the person's semantic network. Even though the person may be relatively unaware that they have this mental association, it nevertheless may result in an unconscious negative attitude toward that group, which can have real behavioral consequences. As just one example, field studies have been conducted where researchers send out mock resumes to real potential employers. The resumes are identical, except for the name. For example, some studies might compare a male name with a female name, or a traditionally white-sounding name with a traditionally non-white-sounding name. These kinds of studies have consistently found evidence of discrimination, that is, unequal treatment, in this case a lower likelihood of receiving a call back from an employer, for traditionally marginalized groups. Is it likely that these employers are intentionally setting out to discriminate? Probably not. Rather, the assumption is that people may be swayed to like a resume more or less because of their implicit biases about men versus women, or about white versus non-white individuals. Other research in the medical field has found evidence of racial bias in pain treatment. Specifically, prior to the opioid crisis, a survey of 310 different health systems found that white patients were more likely to receive an opioid for pain management at 52% compared to black patients at 50%. Even though this was a relatively small difference of only 2%, it was statistically significant. Again, this is likely not due to intentional discrimination on the part of doctors, but rather may be due, at least in part, to their implicit biases. In turn, if people are regularly concerned about receiving potentially unfair treatment due to their group membership, this can lead to experiences of chronic stress and other negative mental and physical health outcomes. Although the phenomenon of implicit bias appears to be fairly well documented, an area of ongoing debate is what to do about it. Is it possible to change people's implicit biases? And if so, how is that best accomplished? While some research has found that interventions such as implicit bias training can be effective, other research has not supported these conclusions. In all, stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination are complex phenomena that are likely a product of structural societal factors just as much as they are individual behavior. There are likely no easy answers to these difficult questions, but in our own lives, we can work to ensure that we treat each person with dignity and respect. For one of my favorite TED Talks on this topic, you can check out The Danger of the Single Story by Chimamanda Adichie in the supplemental videos section on Canvas. In this video, we covered attitudes, attitude change, that is, persuasion, and the related topics of stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination. For the exam, you should be able to define an attitude and identify one in an example, describe the difference between explicit and implicit attitudes, and explain one way that researchers can measure implicit attitudes, that is, with the IAT, describe the difference between the central and peripheral routes to persuasion, and define and distinguish between stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination.